Well, welcome to this latest installment of Government and Economics and the Presidency. Today we're going to get into the actual powers of the presidency in this video lecture number 3. So I hope you're all ready to take some good notes, look at some of the images and text on the screen that should help you and guide you. So let's get started. What does the president do? Well, if we look at Article 2, the president, and Article 2 states, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Wow, that is just wonderfully precise language. Bravo, way to go, founders. So that is rather vague. There's really nothing that detailed in this first explanation or description of the job of president, or that is the executive. And remember, the executive branch is what we're talking about, and certainly that's what the founders were thinking about. So what is it that the founders wanted? Well, we know for one thing that they did not like European models for executive power. That refers to kings, queens, and emperors. And as you can see, this poor chap here on the right has a big X drawn through him. So they did not want to recopy or recapture that idea of the European executive because European executives were too strong and had too many powers vested in them. European executives could conduct foreign affairs, declare war, grant reprieves and pardons, create administrative offices, appoint people to them, direct the bureaucracy, veto legislation, and my favorite of all, call into session or send home legislatures. So European models were really not that satisfactory to the founding fathers. So it's good to be king in Europe, but in the United States, the founding fathers had other ideas, and they really went to great lengths to create a more balanced approach. And again, that idea of balance is something we've encountered quite a lot, actually. So let's think about then the founding fathers, in my opinion and estimation, kind of hedged the powers of the presidency. So you see this hedge here in the image, and you think, oh boy, what does that mean? Well, look at the hedges there. It creates this pathway, this straight pathway from which there's really no escape. There's no deviation. There's no way to go around outside the hedge. So I think that really kind of conveys the idea that the founding fathers had for the presidency, that they wanted to give the president powers, yes, but they wanted to hedge the president, that is, constrain, keep him on, or her, on a narrow path so that they would not become like their European models and precedents. And that was something that they worked a great deal and argued a great deal at the Constitutional Convention, as we saw in the last lecture, or heard in the last lecture. So then let's take a look at the powers of the presidency. And remember, I think the idea of that rock, paper, and scissors, if you remember back to that Annenberg Center video that we saw, really comes back into play. And it's kind of a cool way to think about what the founding fathers were trying to do: limit the power of the presidency, balance those powers with the other branches of government. So let's take a look if I can get this thing to function. Good. So we're going to be looking at 7 different powers of the presidency in this lecture. And we're going to start with power number 1, the power to propose. And if we go to Article 2, Section 3, it says that the president has the right to propose legislation to Congress and for Congress to consider. And we find that in Article 2, Section 3, where it says that the president shall, from time to time, give Congress information about the United States and the state of the Union, and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. And you can see those words. So what the president does in the State of the Union, and you can see this year's picture of President Obama delivering his State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress. The president tells the people, tells Congress, this is how things are, this is the state of our union, this is what we achieved last year, and this is what we are going to try to do going forward. And it's that going forward piece where the president actually proposes ideas. And remember, when we talk about ideas in politics, we're talking about policies, and presidents have policy goals. Presidents are the leaders of their party. In this case, President Obama is a Democrat, so he is the de facto leader of the Democratic Party, and he is in charge of presenting the overall picture and plan for the Democratic Party going forward. And that's what he's doing in the State of the Union address, and what presidents of both parties do in every State of the Union address. So presidents do have a role in influencing policy and laws that Congress will consider. So, but you can also understand, however, and I think this is kind of interesting, President Obama is a Democrat, and he's up there giving his address. It's like, well, why don't Republicans like me? What is wrong with the picture? I'm a nice guy. I'm likable. I'm young. I'm hip. I play sports. I'm active. I'm smart. I'm, whatever you want. But the fact of the matter is we have another gentleman sitting behind the president to his right, and that is the Speaker of the House. His name is John Boehner, in case you've forgotten, and he's a Republican. And we know that the Republican Party currently has a majority in the House of Representatives, and he is quite a happy Republican to have to listen to President Obama talk about his policy goals. And that's not something that Boehner can change. He is forced to sit behind the president and listen to this speech. Now, if the president had been a Republican, you'd see a much happier John Boehner. So that really kind of gets us back to what we see today, is that division between the parties, the antagonism, the mistrust, the suspicions, and some of what we call partisan politics. And so we must remember that while the president can talk all he wants during his State of the Union, or at any other time of the year, frankly, about his policy goals, it's unlikely that the president's going to have any success getting his policy goals turned into actual law if, in fact, the other party controls both chambers or just one chamber of the Congress, and that's currently the situation. Now, if Congress happens to be controlled by the same party as the president, as was the case in President Obama's first 2 years in office, 2009, 2010 into 11, it's more likely that the president will succeed in getting his goals passed into law. And a good example of that is the Health Care Reform Act, known as Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. When Obama was elected in 2008, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, and they worked with President Obama, all being Democrats naturally. So you can see how important it is that a president have support in the Congress for his ideas. And if there is no support, then really there's just no likelihood of many big ideas being passed into law. And that's kind of what we're experiencing today. So the power to propose. Power number 2. Moving forward is the power of the veto. So here the president actually can play a direct role in the legislative process. And veto is a Latin word that means I forbid. And this is a power reserved to the president. It's spelled out in Article 1, Section 7 in clauses 2 and 3. So it's not actually listed under the powers of the president in Article 2. So we have to go back to Congress, Article 1, to find that provision. And what it says is that every bill that Congress passes must be presented to the president for his signature, in which case the president approves, or his rejection, and that is the veto. So a president can either approve or reject a bill that Congress, that is the House and the Senate, have both passed. And if the president decides to veto a bill, that is, reject a bill Congress has sent him, he must list his objections, that is, state his objections, write them down. He sends them back to Congress, and Congress can either act on the president's suggestions. The Congress can override the presidential veto with a 2/3 vote in both chambers, or the Congress can just let it drop. And so there are different things that can occur. But the idea that the president has a veto gives the president some influence over the lawmaking process, as members of Congress will most likely take into consideration a president's ideas and stated policy goals. And of course, the president and his staff do a very good job of interacting and communicating to Congress their thoughts about bills being discussed, debated in Congress. So oftentimes just the mere threat of a veto will alter the course of legislation in Congress. And that's even true even if Congress is controlled by another party, because the Congress doesn't want to necessarily come to this showdown and a veto. And you have to remember that yes, Congress can override a presidential veto, but it's very difficult to obtain the 2/3 votes necessary. So that is a pretty important power. It's one that hasn't been exercised a lot by President Obama. President Bush before Obama did so more often. So let's move on to power number 3. This is called the Take Care Clause. Article 2, Section 3 states that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. again, wonderfully vague language, which is going to allow different presidents in different time periods to interpret what this means and act in different ways. And in many cases, we see presidents trying to expand or increase their powers. And again, if you go back to the text of the Constitution, as we just read, the president shall take care that laws be faithfully executed. It's not very precise. It's very vague, and the founders kind of wanted it that way. They wanted there to be this room to expand, give and take, some play, if you will, elasticity. Again, going back to that elastic clause, even with the powers of the president. So they wanted to avoid powerful European monarchs, but they also wanted to give the president enough power so that we didn't repeat the mistakes and problems of the Articles of Confederation. So this clause says that in normal times, presidents really just have to administer the laws that Congress passed and he has signed. In normal times, presidents administer, that is, carry out the laws that Congress has passed and he has signed. However, what happens when there are extraordinary circumstances, such as, for example, the Civil War in 1861? President Lincoln, the president of the time, said, look, these are extraordinary times, and we need to take extraordinary actions and measures to save the Union, to defend the Union. So one of the things that President Lincoln did was he suspended the right of habeas corpus when one is arrested. That is, they have to be presented with formal charges, and President Lincoln did away with that and said, I'm the wartime commander-in-chief, and therefore I deem it necessary to do so. So extraordinary times often lead to extraordinary measures, and this is interesting. And the definition of extraordinary is what really we need to look at. What defines extraordinary? It's up to the individual president, and those presidents, like Lincoln, are going to make strong arguments, persuasive arguments. And if the times really are extraordinary, it's likely that the American people will buy them, though there will be opposition. So that is an interesting thing to look at. So that is the take care clause, and that's going to lead us to the next power. Power number 4, the appointment power, and that follows on the heels of the taking care clause. Presidents argue that if they are to take care to execute, that is, administer the laws faithfully, they have to be able to appoint and remove officials who work for them in what is known as the executive branch of government. But the founders, while giving the president the power to appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, consuls, and judges of the Supreme Court, also recognized that they didn't want to give the president free rein or a blank check to hire whomever. So what the founding fathers did was they said the Senate was going to have a role in the appointment process, and that was going to be advice and consent. And that is that the Senate has to meet and discuss the president's appointees, and then the Senate must vote to approve them. And this becomes very difficult at times because, especially when you have times of heightened partisanship or antagonism between the parties, you remember that in the Senate there are certain rules and procedures so that one senator can filibuster, one senator can place a hold on a judicial appointment or an appointment to a minister. They call them ministers, but they're really secretary positions, such as the Secretary of State or just recently the chairman of the Federal Reserve. So one senator in many cases and instances is able to hold up the works if they don't like the president's nomination or appointment. So this really leads to some interesting struggles between the executive branch, the president, and the Senate that has been given this power to advise and consent. The Congress also has the right to create new positions in the executive branch and to define the powers of those positions. So the founders really did give Congress a large role in the executive branch process. And we saw this after 9/11. Congress created the new Office of Homeland Security and defined its powers. So again, we see that the president has powers, but they're balanced. And think again of that idea of hedging the powers of the president. Let's go on to power number 5, that is foreign relations. And here's where the president typically had most of his powers, and many understood that this was really the president's primary area of operation, where he could operate without much interference from Congress. And it says in Section 2, Article 2, Section 2, the president shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, and 2/3 of the senators must agree. So here again, though the president can engage in foreign nations, and here you see Obama with then Russian President Medvedev signing a treaty to reduce ballistic missiles, the president needs the consent of the Senate. Okay, we'll pick up next time. Thank you very much.